And it's just pending.
Cool.
And now it's recording.
Excellent. Okay, so as Mark has said, we're going to get into some automation extravaganza with myself. Basically, I think one of the main things that I've found over the last couple of years of rolling out modern management and specifically Intune to clients is that a lot of clients will come to us and say, we want to do a greenfields environment. We're just everything brand new and shiny. And then about a week into the engagement, we realized that there's a lot of on-prem resources that they haven't really considered as part of this project, and they're mission critical. They need these resources, and I think everyone knows what I'm talking about, which is on-prem file servers and as well as printers. No one ever really thinks about printers until they need to print something and they're not there. How long ago was this, Steve? Probably 3 years now, when we did our first rollout.
Yeah, 3 years.
3 years.
2017.
Yeah. So we were doing a rollout, and they got to the point that I was just explaining, where they were like, this all works great. How do I access my G drive, or how do I access this? And no one had really thought about it, and we didn't really have a solution. We asked them previously how they'd done it, and they had group policy objects set up to deploy the drives based on security group mappings through Active Directory. And obviously we just don't have that. And I say obviously because all of the work that we've done is cloud only, so not domain joined. And it obviously means that we don't have access to AAD or LDAP connectivity from the client devices. How am I going? Am I losing anyone yet? No, I can't see the comments, so
no, you're all good, and we've just added an extra person, so there you go.
Excellent. Okay, great. All right, so there's the problem. We've got a client that needs on-premise file shares, and they've promised us that in 6 to 12 months they'll move to SharePoint and all that sort of stuff. But basically, if we can't get this working, we have to just pull up stumps and give up for the time being. And obviously the project can't fail, or it can't stop, because we're there to get this over the line. So we need a solution to mimic the existing infrastructure and solutions that they have themselves. So this is where this solution comes in. And basically what we're utilizing is Azure Active Directory, and hopefully they've got AAD Connect set up so that all the security groups and users and all that sort of stuff are being synced over to AAD. We're going to use a function app, which sits as a middleware solution to get the security group access of a member. And then we're going to use a PowerShell script that runs on the end user's machine to call that function app to get the memberships of the user that is on the machine. Sounds a little confusing. I think I have a diagram of it. I can share that out as well. So the first thing that we need to do in this scenario, obviously this is we need to talk to the client, and we need to identify exactly what their drive mappings are and how those drive mappings are currently being allocated. Most of the time, these will be based on security groups or OU security groups. We just need to document that. That's the most important thing, just understanding the environment before we do that. And I think that just goes to, for everything. When you're starting to look at process automation, if you don't know what the environment is, you can't automate the thing. And I think that that's a very important thing to point out at the beginning. So what I've done is I've gone in and created a couple of security groups in my tenant. Just imagining that there are two, for the company powers-hell.com, there are 3 sites in Australia. There's a Sydney office A, Sydney office B, and a Melbourne office A. Each of these offices have their own security groups. They have their own requirements as far as access to file shares. They have their own printers, things like that. So for the scenario, I've said that Sydney office A and B have file shares and printers, but Melbourne office A doesn't, because it's awesome and it's all cloud-based, because Melbourne's incredible, and I'm probably the only person from Melbourne in this chat. I've added myself and Steve's account into a couple of these things, just so that we can see. So Sydney office A, at the moment, we've got myself. Sydney office B, we've got Steve, and I'm also a member of the Melbourne office A. So basically that means that we're going to get different things, or we should get access to different things based on the requirements of the company. Okay, so once we understand the environment and we've got our security groups created with all our user memberships, what we need now is to create that middleware solution that allows us to find out what a specific user is a member of as far as security groups. Now, obviously, back in Active Directory days, that was quite easy. We've probably all seen a million different kinds of Visual Basic scripts that just access those security group memberships through LDAP queries. Unfortunately, as I said at the beginning, we don't have access to that, so we need to come up with a solution to do that on behalf of the user. And that's where in the Azure space, function apps come into play. And call out in the comments if anyone's actually used function apps. I'm going to kind of breeze over this a little bit, but if anyone does want any more detail, we can get into that. So I'm just going to go into the function app. Now, I've actually created this before because it can take a little while to set up, but I've just created a function app called PowerShell logon script. And inside here, I've got nothing actually in my production. Now, I've set up what is called slots. So I've got a UAT slot and a production slot. That's primarily for when we're doing the CI/CD deployment of this solution. I can go into that as well, but just suffice to say that currently in this function app, in the production slot, there is no functions. This is an empty solution. I do have, as I said, I've got a UAT slot, and in here, I should have one because my test ran through and it's built. So at the moment, I have one function app that's been created. Now, as far as creating the function app, this is as far as I go in the Azure portal, because the sort of the key story in this session is automation. I was going to try and avoid this, but I think it's really important to show everyone the importance of not using the portal to write production code and actually using DevOps to do a little bit of source control. Because if you're not familiar with source control or locking down code so that you know exactly what is happening, you really need to, and really, really important, and not as complicated as I'm probably making it seem. Okay, so we've got our function, we've got our security groups, we know our members, we know the basic of our environment. So what we now need to do is we need to create our solution. So I'm just going to switch my screen over really quickly to my VS Code environment. Just give me one tick. I tried to do this in my, I've got VS Code Online, but it did not work very nicely, so I apologize. Sorry, guys. Bright for everyone. All right, so in my code, now I'm not going to get into too deep about how I've created all of this. This can be taken offline and I can explain it. But I've basically in here, I've got a few things. I've got some tests to make sure that my code works. I've got some pipeline data, which I'll show you in a second. I've got a drive map schema, which we can go into. But the key thing here is this function app folder. So I've generated this from an extension in VS Code called Azure Functions. It just assists you with making like a template function app so that you don't need to know how to do it. It just creates the framework for you and then you build the code. Now, it is fair to say that in this function app, I'm writing everything in PowerShell because it just makes everything easier. There's not another language that we need to learn, and PowerShell is awesome, hence my name. Okay, so in this function app, I have one function, the AAD set group query. So in here, we have a couple of files. The only two important ones here are run.ps1, which is the actual code that triggers when the function app is called. And then we have the drivemaps.json file. Now, this is a custom file that we've created for this solution, and I've simplified it as much as I can just to show you sort of how this works. So as I said, in this sample environment, we've got three sites. We've got Sydney office A, Sydney office B, and a Melbourne office that has nothing. So it's not going to get anything. In the actual solution, we have a couple of things here. We've got drives. So what drives are we going to map? What printers are we going to map? And do we have any printers that we need to remove? This is an important one that got added later once people realized that they were migrating their solutions and they had no way to delete printers. So that's just put in there. But let's just step into the drives and have a look here. So in here, we've got a couple of different groups, and I'm calling these groups, these are delineated based on access. So we're calling base. Base is literally what everyone gets. So every single person in the company, regardless of what membership they have, they're going to get this drive to be mapped onto their computer. And that is, the domain is powers-hell.com and the folder is shared. It's going to map to drive S. Down here, we have the security-based, or let's call it RBAC for short, memberships. So we've got Sydney Office A and Sydney Office B. In Sydney Office A, we've got access to a folder on the server called Sydney Office A, and that's going to get mapped to X. If you're a member of Sydney Office B, however, you're going to get the same drive letter mapped to a different location. This is a fairly common scenario for most organizations where they have a shared or a generic drive that is different based on location. I'm not going to comment on why I think that's a terrible idea, but let's just say this is a very, very common scenario. Okay, so are there any questions at the moment about how this is set up, about JSON, anything like that?
Nothing in the chat window right now.
Okay, great. So down to printers, it's a very similar setup. We have base and then we have RBAC memberships. So in base, everyone is going to get a printer called Follow Me Print that is sitting on printserver.powershell.com. Everyone that is a member of Sydney Office A are going to get 2 more printers. So print server they're all on the same print server. They're just different queues. So printer 1 and printer 2. Sydney Office B and Melbourne for this scenario don't have their own printers, so they're not going to get any extra ones. They're just going to get the Follow Me Print. Printers to remove, I've just got an example. There isn't any printers we're going to remove, so that's fine. But let's just say we had an old print server called oldserver.corp, and we just want to make sure that that's no longer on the machines if it was there to begin with. So this file is really important because once you actually deploy this solution and you hopefully hand it over to the client, this is the only file that they will need to modify. All of the other stuff that looks quite complex should in theory never get changed. This file is your Bible as far as access and modifying drives. And hopefully when you get to the point that they start moving to SharePoint, you'll be able to modify this so that you can utilize SharePoint and synchronize those drives as well, which is something that I've spoken about on Steve's Intune training, and I've written a couple of blogs on it as well. All right, so now we'll just quickly brush over the actual code in the function app because it can look kind of complex, but I'll just sort of explain what it's doing and we'll just move from there. So the actual function app itself is sitting on a function app that only runs or only builds itself out when a HTTP call gets made to it. So it's basically just a code as a service. And basically when you hit the endpoint, it builds an environment out and it runs this code with the parameters that are sent to it. So we've got some request data and we've got some trigger metadata as well. What we're basically doing is we're sending the function app some very basic information, which is the name of the computer and the user principal name. I got that right? The user principal name of the person who has requested that or sent that request. So once we've got the name of the machine and the UPN of the person who's requested it, what we're basically doing is we're going in to where, let's have a look here. So we're authenticating into Graph using some fairly basic data. These are all just well-known application IDs and things like that. Getting into Graph can be a whole other story. But basically all we're doing is we're querying one thing. So we're going to Graph and we're going, show me the users, but filter them for users that have a user principal name that starts with the thing that we've sent through. So in my scenario, my computer logs in, my UPN is ben@powershell.com. That username is going to get, or that UPN is going to get sent to this function app. The function app's going to spin up and it's going to do this query, which is show me all the users that start with ben@powershell.com. And that's hopefully only going to send back one response. So once we have that information, we then step through that user object, and then we do another query. So it is show me all the users with a unique ID, and that's why we do that initial thing. All we're doing is just grabbing the ID of the user. So show me the user with this user ID, and then show me the member of, or the, what security groups that user is a member of. Once we have that information, we're home and hosed. So we're basically at the same point as we are with an older concept of LDAP. We know what the memberships are, and then the rest of the code is basically just getting those memberships and just putting them against that drivemaps.json to see whether anything matches. So I don't care whether you're a member of 30 different security groups. I only care if you're a member of security groups that exist in drivemaps.json. So in this scenario, Sydney office A and Sydney office B. So the Melbourne office A has nothing because they're super agile and they don't care. But at this point, I just need to know if you're a member of A or B, we're going to do some things and we're going to send some stuff back. Does it all make sense so far? I'll take the silence as a resounding yes.
We'll go with the yes on that.
Excellent. Okay, so we've got this code. It's all good. In theory, it all looks like it should work. So now what we need to do is we need to publish this to our function. Now, normally what you would do is you've created your function app, and you would just go in to the functions thing, and you would click new function, and you just throw that code in and save it, and then hope that no one else goes in and changes it. So what I want to show now. And I really apologize because this is throwing a lot of new concepts to a lot of people, I believe. But I really want to show you the correct way to maintain and publish code to function apps so that you don't need to cross your fingers and hope that people don't touch this. You can actually lock it down. Okay, so let's go over to my DevOps environment. I've created a repository called EUC PowerShell logon script. And the code, I'm just going to switch my screen over now. Let's look here, summary. I wonder if I can change my theme.
While you're doing that, Ben, does anybody want to come off mute and ask any questions or anything like that while Ben's just sorting through this? Or are we all good and comfortable with where everything's at?
Cool.
Take it as comfortable.
Yeah, I'll show everyone sort of the what it looks like when you run this script as well as a user, awesome. Just so that you can sort of see, what the end result is as well. But as I said, like this is a fairly simple thing, but to sort of get it working, there's quite a lot of there's quite a lot of work to it. So
So Bruce has a question around the authentication to map drives.
Yeah.
Or didn't we get there? So do you want me to take this one, or are you happy to do it?
Yeah, no, of course, man. Go for it.
So the thing with authentication is you need to be turning on Hello for Business. Oh, sorry. If you're turning on Hello for Business, you need to have hybrid key trust or certificate trust authentication turned on. If you're not in a position to turn those technologies on, you need to turn off Hello for Business, so long as the same user account on-prem is consistent with the user account in AAD that you're signing on with, it'll just automatically authenticate. So basically, it's the difference between modern authentication with Hello for Business and using the standard authentication from not Hello for Business.
Hello for Business, is that the technical term?
It's a very technical term. I didn't want to call it non-modern.
Yeah.
Legacy.
Legacy. It's legacy. Let's come on. It's legacy. At this point, it's legacy.
So yeah, basically that gives you the position of you either have to have hybrid key trust or a way for the device authentication to be written down into your user profile from AAD to be able to authenticate with the Kerberos tokens from the domain controllers, or you need to have Hello for Business turned off.
Yep.
And there's videos on that on the Intune training that are far too long. But hey, we got it in the can, and it only took us 8 hours. There's only 2 hours of videos.
But to be fair, it can take about 3 hours to set that stuff up as well, doing the full modern auth stack. So,
Yes.
it's complicated, but in theory, you only need to do it once per tenant. So
That's right. And the value prop is huge.
exactly.
Like the experience that you get from your end users is really something that they enjoy.
That's right. That's right.
I'll let Ben continue on.
Okay, great. So I've stepped into my DevOps environment. As you can see, this is the same thing that we were looking at in Visual Studio Code, and it should be because this is the same repository. So just to confirm, we've got our function app in here. We've got the AAD set group query. We've got our drivemaps.json, and we've got our run.ps1. Okay, so that's all good. The code is there, but how do we move it from DevOps into our production environment, into our Azure portal? With that, what we do is we create a deployment pipeline or a CI/CD pipeline, and this is all as code as well, which I know it scares quite a lot of people, but it really shouldn't. It just means that it's maintainable. So in this Azure.pipelines.yaml file, I actually have the entire build and release pipeline. So everything, every stage and every task that I'm actually going to be doing is just written down as code. So it's only 100 lines of code. At the moment, it's only going to UAT. It's not pushing to production because we don't need to do that. But I'll show you how this is all set up as well. So we'll go over to the left and we'll go into our pipelines. I have one pipeline, and we can see the last time it ran, it was successful, which is great. And we're just going to go into that, and we're going to edit. And we see the exact same thing that we were looking at the Azure pipelines with some color coding and things like that. I won't get super deep into this because this is another session that we could spend hours on this. But just understand that pipelines now are primarily built using the YAML markdown structure. The only difference between YAML and JSON is that YAML is designed to be inherently more readable, but the trade-off is that it is very important about spacing and formatting of your environment or of your markdown file. So you need to make sure that everything is tabbed in correctly, and if it's not, it's going to give you big red errors, and it's going to tell you exactly where the failure is. So it seems a bit daunting if you've never used it before, but I promise you it's really not. So the actual pipeline itself, it's not that complicated. We have a trigger so that anything that goes into our master branch in this repository will kick this pipeline off if it is in this inclusion. So what I've done is I've gone, anything that gets committed into the repository that is a change to this file only will kick off the build. So what that means is that the only thing that will kick off a build is a modification to drivemaps.json. And the point of this is, as if we go back a little bit, I was saying that this file is the only thing that the client will end up modifying. So the rest of the code shouldn't kick off a build unless I go in, make the change, and then do a manual kickoff myself. So this stops the client from going in and making changes and breaking things. And it also just gives us the control that we need, that we previously didn't have. So we're setting a couple of variables just around the location of where our JSON file is, where our schema is. I just realized I didn't go into the schema. I don't think we really need to get into that, but Steve, tell me if I'm wrong.
There's no need to jump into that schema.
Yeah, cool. Okay. And then we have the function path, which is just the root of the function app. These are just things for our build code that we're using. It's not important, but just understand that this is how you set variables, especially global variables for all of your tasks. We're then defining our stages. Now, this is a very modern pipeline. This is what is called a multi-stage pipeline. What this allows me to do is have multiple stages and multiple tasks where we can build out different environments for each one of these stages. And we can also include our release pipeline in the same code, which is a more advanced subject, but it's the future of all CI/CD pipeline stuff. So it's worthwhile reading about. We only have a couple of tasks in the build tests. So this is basically setting up an environment to run some pester tests. And this is all it's doing. So it's basically just checking the code against the schema that I've set up and publishing those tests. Now, if the JSON file is corrupt or written incorrectly by the client or the IT person who's working on this, we're not going to get any further. It's just going to throw an error, and it's going to tell you exactly where in the code the failure is, so that you can then go in and fix it. You're going to get emails. Yep.
Just put it out there as well. This also includes not following Ben's capitalization format.
Yes.
And things like that, right?
Yeah.
So it's very strict.
But it doesn't have to be. So
yeah.
This scenario I built so that we can. I mean, I stepped this out 5 minutes before I joined the meeting because I've been working too much, and it all just worked because I followed my guidelines that I set. Now, I obviously don't expect that when I hand it over to a client that they're going to follow those guidelines, but I do expect that if they don't, it's not going to end up in production, and that's the key thing. So if it fails and I get a phone call going, Ben, I don't know why this isn't working, I can go into their DevOps environment, I can see the error, and I can go, that's cool, I can show you why that's not working, and then we can spend a little bit of time on learning, the ins and outs of that. If we're sort of short on time. Otherwise, I'll show them the exact schema requirements and that sort of stuff. And obviously, you can set it up however you want. So this is the test stuff. So we're not going to get any further if the JSON file was malformed or incorrect. Once we're happy that that JSON file was filled out correctly or modified correctly, we're then going to deploy it to our UAT slot, as we were saying. So we've got the UAT and the production slot. So in here, we're doing a couple more, so we can see depends on build tests. So basically, this stage, if this fails, this stage is not going to continue. That's all that line means, and that's very important. So we're saying that the modified JSON file has successfully been built. So we pass that logic check, and then we move on to deploying. So what we're doing here is we're just zipping up the actual function app. Not complicated. It's literally just going, here's the function app. I want to put it into a zip file with the build ID. The build ID gets generated every single time as a new ID based on the run of the CI/CD pipeline. And then we're going to publish that zip file to our Azure function app with a couple of details. So Azure subscription is basically I've made a service connection into our subscription. I know it's called function app because that's what we're publishing. I know that the name of my function app is PowerShell logon script, and then a couple of more details. So the resource group name, what slot I want to deploy it to, and exactly where the zip file is. I actually just want to show you. So this is obviously just code. If you've not seen this before, it can seem quite complex. And the first question I always get asked is, I don't know how to write this. How can I start? So on the left, right-hand side of the screen, you can see this taskbar. So if we type in function, we can see a couple of different tasks. Now, these are basically helper task builders for you. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into Azure Functions, and then this helps us build this from scratch so that if we don't know how to create this, we don't just give up and ask someone else to do it. So what we'll do is we'll go in here. Now, see, I've already created a service connection, but if I hadn't, that wouldn't show up, and I'd just step through and I'd select my subscription and I'd approve it and that sort of stuff. But we'll just select that. The app type, give it a second here. So we've got two options, function app on Windows or function app on Linux. For now, let's go Windows. The app name, if I have multiple function apps, which I do, I can choose which one I want to deploy it to. For this case, I want to deploy it to PowerShell logon script. Whether we want to deploy to slots, which we do. So resource group, I select my resource group, and then I choose my my slots. Now you can have as many as you want, obviously, but in this case, I've only got production and UAT. I'm happy with my package location for now. If it was different, I'd change it here. We've got some additional deployment options, but we don't need to worry about that for now. This is primarily just showing you what this is going to look like. So we'll just go in here and we'll click Add, and you can see it's built out basically the same thing as this this one that I wrote myself. So we've got the task, and then we've got the inputs inside of that task. So this is a really great way to allow you to sort of get into this space and start playing around. So, just searching for the names of things like copy, you can go Azure file copy. If you need to copy a file from this into a storage account or whatever, it's a really good way to sort of understand how these tasks are built out so that you can then reuse that code for later. So we'll just delete that for now. So once we've zipped up our code, we've published it, we then publish that artifact for our next part. So we've published it into our function app, and then that zip file that we've created, we've published the artifact so that we can do something with it later. Now that's an important thing that we'll talk about once we've sort of finished going through this. Finally, what we're doing here is a final stage, which is called UAT tests. So again, this depends on the previous stage succeeding or not. So if for whatever reason this fails, we're not going to bother trying to test UAT because there's no point. Now, UAT is another round of pester tests. It's the same testing that we did originally, but instead of testing the code that sits in the repository, we're actually doing some calls to the UAT function app just to make sure that it returns the data that we expect. These are all custom pester tests, but they're not complicated. And I will make this stuff available in GitHub at the end of this session so that if anyone is actually interested, they can go in and have a look. So I know that sounds like a lot, but really we're just doing three things. We're testing to make sure that the JSON file isn't corrupt. We're publishing the code that we are confident is correct to a UAT slot. And then we're making sure that that UAT function app works as expected without us having to go in and test it. And this is the key thing that we sort of go back to that concept of automation, is that we could ignore this stage and get an email saying that it's been published to UAT, and then we could test it. But this way we can test it and just know that it's successful. And if it's successful at this point, we could then create a release pipeline and publish it to production, being confident that following these processes, we know that the code is reliable and we know that it works in a test environment, so we can push it to production. Does that all make sense? I love the silence. Okay. So
it makes sense to me, but
it makes sense to you.
You and I have spent a lot of time on this, but the responses that we're getting in the chat window is very positive and very complimentary for you. So
excellent. Okay, cool. So all right, so we've got this built. All right, it's in our UAT environment. We can see AAD set group. Actually, let's go back a step. I just want to show you what a successful build looks like, and I can even kick one off. It's going to take a little while to run because I've got 3 different stages. And basically what a stage means is that every single time you create a stage, it actually creates a run space, or it's basically a virtual machine, for lack of a better term, with all the build tools that you need, and it's completely containerized and has, it disappears as soon as it's finished. So for each stage, I'm actually building up a brand new environment to make sure that I've got no old data. So the positive there is that I know that these tests are always fresh and clean. The downside is that it does take a little bit longer to complete the build. And in this scenario, you can see that the last build took 3 minutes and 50 seconds, which isn't much. But 3 minutes and 50 seconds in a presentation can be a very long time. So you can see here that we've got 3 ticks, which each tick is for each stage, making sure that they've gone through. We've got our build test, we've got our deploy UAT, and we've got our UAT tests. We can see that I've passed every single test that I've defined, and we can see that we have 1 published artifact. So again, these tests exist in the build tests and UAT tests, and the artifact is generated in this stage. So if we go into the test, we can actually see 100%. It's taken 546 milliseconds to do all of these tests, which is pretty cool. And we're not going to see by default any of the successful ones, because the idea of testing is that we only need to see the failed ones. But if we want to see the successful ones, we can go in here and we can see JSON validation. We can make sure that the JSON file syntax is good. Just a couple of things that I've validated myself that I expect should be there. The UAT validation stuff is the function app should successfully return a value, which is 200, which means in HTTP world that it's successful. The return response should be a well-formed JSON file. And then just a couple of other things, like we should at least have some drives, we should have some printers. And I can see from those tests that this is successful, so I can just move ahead with this. The final thing is, if we go in here, the artifact that I was talking about. So this is deploy 149. So this is build ID 149. It's automatically generated for me, and we can have as many artifacts as we want. If we go in here, we can see there's a zip file, and I can download that. But there's no point. It's the code that we've built. It's probably going to start trying to download it, which is great. Yeah, there we go, 149.zip. So let's ignore that for the moment and just understand that that is the same code that we've written ourselves. It's just extracted only what it needs to actually run in the function app. Okay, so now let's do, we'll replicate what the UAT test does just so that you can see what the end result of this function app is. And then we can talk about how you can implement this in your Intune environment in a production. So we've gone into our function app, we've gone into our UAT slot. Again, we haven't moved this to production because we don't need to for this scenario. And we've gone into the specific function app. And what we need to do is we need to get the function URL. So this is the endpoint that is that what we do is when we call this, it builds the function app for us, which is very, very quick. And then it runs the code in that run.ps1, and then it returns us a value that we've defined ourselves. So I'm going to copy that, and then I'm going to quickly switch screens. 1 second. This one here. And I'm going to create a new screen here. Now, do I need to make this bigger, guys? Can you see that? How's that?
Looks good to me. Everybody's starting to come back and say it's all good.
Okay, great. So, all right. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to sort of show you what that final test does, because that test is exactly what would happen when a user logs onto their computer and sort of runs the actual logon script itself. And just to clarify again, that what this function app is not your logon script. This is the middleware solution that just gives us the security group memberships and what drives you should be getting. So you need to write a logon script that runs on the end user's machines, which we have a solution for. Which, you know, if you hit me up on Twitter, we can definitely talk about that. So this is fairly simple. We're just going to throw that function endpoint URL into a variable. So let's just call it URI is this. Okay, so it's not complicated. This is the URL of the where the function app exists. The actual app within the function app is AAD setgroup query, and then we just have an authentication code that basically just allows us to go, look, if I'm hitting this endpoint with this code, I'm allowed to run the code. So if this is your key into the function app, if anyone ever gets this, you can change the codes. This is basically your client secret. So treat it with the respect it needs, but understand that if anyone ever gets access to it, you can always regenerate that very quickly. Okay, so the UPN of my user is ben@powershell.com. Generally, what I would be doing to capture this in a logon script is I'd actually be doing who am I /UPN. For those that don't know, this will actually get me back the user of the UPN of the user who actually runs the code. So in this case, it's breader@vigilant.it. Obviously, for this scenario, I want to use ben@powershell.com, so I can't use who am I, but this is what we use in the production logon script because it gets us exactly what we need. Okay, so we've got the URI, we've got the UPN. Now the full URI query is URI. This is going to test I think it's question UPN. No, it's not. Sorry, I should have tested this beforehand. All right, I'm gonna cheat. It's looking for user. Okay. Equals UPN. All right, so if I just run this and then I paste this down, I'll show you what it's really doing. It's just slamming these two variables together with an and user equals a command in here to get us this unique URI. So again, it's just the full URI of the function app, and then we're throwing a command or a query parameter into the request, which is the user variable is ben@powershell.com. I have absolutely no idea whether this is going to work, so let's give it a go. So what we're going to do now is we're going to invoke a request to that function app to spin it up and get that data. In PowerShell, we do that by going invoke web request. Yep. No, REST method. What am I doing? It's been a long day. All right, the method here is, he's going to catch up, is get, because we're asking to pull back information from the endpoint. The URI is URI query. And I think that's all we need to do. Use basic. No, that doesn't exist on that. That should be enough. So let's do this and see what happens.
2 people have been jailed for the kidnapping and torture of a disabled woman who was thrown off Windsor Bridge and into the Hawkesbury River.
Interesting.
We just muted you there, Phil.
Sorry, mate.
That's okay. That's fine.
I was racing to do the mute, but I forgot to.
That's fantastic.
Cheers.
All good.
All right, so this code's come through successfully, and we've got some data back, which is really cool. But what we want to do is we actually want to run it again and store the result in a variable so that we can do something with it. Because at the moment, it's just sort of thrown it at a wall, and that's it. We're not going to do anything further with it. So let's just go. Let's just call this to map, right? And we'll run it again. So now let's have a look at the results from each of these things. So we go into to map. Not tokens, to map, and let's look at the drives. So we can see here that I've only got one thing because, and again, if we remember, I'm only a member of Melbourne Office A. I'm not a member of Sydney Office A or B. So all I should get, according to my drive maps here, let me bring this down, is this base. So PowerShell.com shared drive letter S. And we can confirm that by looking at that. So when my logon script runs on my machine, this is the only thing I'm going to get access to. I'll go through the rest of the thing. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the UPN to be Steve's account just to show you the difference that we get there. So let's bring this back up and we'll have a look at the printers. So again, I've only got the one, follow me print, because I'm not a member of Sydney Office A or B, but I should be getting that base one. And to map, what was the other thing? Printer to remove. So this is just going to give me that printer. So if our code handles that, it's going to handle it. Otherwise, we can remove that out of our solution moving forward. So we can see here that now we're starting to get some data and we can actually start doing things with this. So we know that we're going to have a UNC path. We know we're going to have a drive letter. So the next step is to go. So once we've got that data, we're just going to write a function to go for every single item in toMap.drives. I want to throw the UNC path and the drive letter into my function, which will just map doing, like set Samba mapping or however you want to do it. Hell, you could use netuse if you really wanted to. I wouldn't recommend it. But the sort of the key goal here is that we can now, with very little effort moving forward, query every single user in our organization to make sure to see whether they're a member of Sydney Office A or Sydney Office B, and if they are, get those things back, which is where we were stuck initially, and we still are. Like at the end of the day, this solution is still a requirement because there is no native way to query this data. So let's change the UPN to Steve and hope that I set this up correctly. Cool. So now we're going to go to map. If I can type, that would help. Drives. We'll bring up a couple more. Printers. Okay. So now we've changed the invoke REST method to query for Steve's details, and we should be getting some new stuff. So let's have a look at drives. And we're only getting shared. That's interesting. I thought I put you in, but maybe I didn't. Follow me print. Okay. Let me just quickly, I'm just going to check something here.
Yeah, I'm in there.
Groups. You are?
Yeah. And I just unmuted the wrong screen. Because line 2, you can see mine. Oh, hang on. No, if you go to the JSON, I was looking at the line above it.
Sydney Office A. Okay, so I've probably butchered my code. Sydney office B.
Did you put me in as Stephen or Steve?
Steve. But I'm also a member of some different Sydney offices though. I've cooked something.
Okay.
It's production. It's fantastic. Okay, so look, I've probably got a typo somewhere in my code. As I said, I built this 5 minutes before the presentation themselves. But the concept there is that you set up your environments, you create unique entries for your security groups. And then what it's going to do is it's going to query that membership and actually pull back the members that you're a member of, query it against the drive map, and then it's going to send you those results. Unfortunately, it's not showing me exactly what I want, which is great. But the concept here is fairly sound, and we've successfully used this in, I want to say, 7 different rollouts with very minimal modifications. Yeah. So, and we've rolled it out with very minimal modification to the code set, aside from the actual drive maps.json file, because the rest of the code itself is so generic that we can lift and shift this and get it up and running with very minimal modifications required, which is really the important thing. I actually think I know why this has failed, and it's because I didn't create the application membership in my tenant. I don't know whether it's worth showing that or not, or we can just sort of wrap up there.
May as well. We've got a little bit of time, unless everybody else wants something else.
Let me just share my screen. I was doing so well. Okay, in tune. So what I'm checking here is, so to query Azure Active Directory in Intune through Microsoft Graph, you need to have a registered application ID. Now, I did use a fairly standard one. I'm just thinking now I probably needed to create a unique one for this environment so that it worked. I might have tried to reuse another one. So to sort of do this, and just to show you the minimal amount of access that you need for this to run successfully, what we're going to do is we're going to go into application registrations. I'm going to create a new registration, and we'll just give it AD sec group query. Accounts in this organization only, and we'll just give this HTTPS localhost. That doesn't matter at this point. So we're just creating an endpoint or an application that has a couple of permissions. I'm going to go into API permissions. So by default, all applications that you generate have user read as a delegated permission. That's fine. That's all good. We're going to go into Microsoft Graph, and we're going to go. Let's have a look here. I think it's application permissions. I'm doing this all without looking at any notes. So let's go. Directory, I need read all. So again, this is just read all data. So it's actually not super risky to publish. I'm going to go users, read all, and group. Read all. So it's pretty self-explanatory why we need this. We need to be able to read all user data. We need to be able to read the group data, which is the group memberships, and then we just need read access to the directory so that we can get sort of the bottom tier of all of that information. So once we update this, we can see that we've got directory read all, group read all, use read all, user read all as an application. So all of these application things mean that our code will run on behalf of the user. So the user is not actually authenticating, but we're using an application ID and a client secret to actually log in. The last thing we need to do is we just need to give permission. So we're going to grant admin consent. To do this, you need to be a global admin of your tenant. And that's it. So basically, what I would then need to do, and I'm not going to do it on this because I feel like I've been talking for a very long time, is I'd go into my overview. I would grab the application ID. So this is the unique ID for these permissions. I would then go into certificates, and I'd create a new client secret. and I just put that information in, and then using the application ID and the client secret will give me the token that I need to do that query and actually get that data correctly. So basically what happened in the example was that I didn't have the permission to go in and get the security group memberships. So the only thing I got back was that baseline, because the code itself said, yeah, I can't see that you're a member of anything, but at the very least, I'm going to give you the baseline data, because it doesn't need to access AD or it doesn't need to access graph to get that. It's just in the JSON file. So yeah. Any questions at all? I'm going to stop sharing for a hot second so I can see the chat window.
So Jose is asking, how do you secure the function app URL on the Intune app?
How do I secure it? In what respect?
My assumption is when you make the call, how do you make sure that nobody else is grabbing that and pulling the information back?
So when you, so the way that it works is that function app sitting there with an endpoint that's just sitting there waiting for anyone to successfully call it. To do that, it also needs to know the that client, the function code, or the API code for that function app. But then the actual connection between the client device and Azure to the function app is all HTTPS. So there's no way to sort of do a man-in-the-middle attack and get that data. So it's secure end-to-end, basically, is the answer to that. Now, the only scenario that I haven't run into this, but the only scenario I've ever really had an answer for like a possible security problem is what happens if someone gets the full URI, including the code of your function app. And the answer is you just regenerate the code and then redeploy your logon script with the new code. So it's as secure as if you start noticing that people are you're getting strange calls or a lot of failures on those calls, because again, the call will fail if the UPN is malformed, or if that user does not exist in your AAD, it's not going to return anything. So even if someone got the function app URI, they got the code and somehow figured out, the full UPN of your CEO, that's the only way they're actually going to find out what security groups a user is a member of, but they're only going to be able to find out the security groups that exist in the drivemaps.json file. So the level of data that could potentially leak out of your environment is minimal at best. And the worst case scenario is that you just regenerate the key for your function app and then push out your logon script so that anyone who's got the code no longer has it.
Obviously, feel free to jump off mute if you want to ask questions as well. Given the size of the crowd, we have more than enough space to be able to have those sorts of conversations.
Definitely.
Cool. So I see that there's no other questions in there. So probably the question I'd have for you, Ben, is how receptive have end users been, or not end users, but IT staff been around taking on this sort of transitional from using NetLogon and a folder where you can just save a script to putting source control in and handling all that scary dev stuff?
Yeah, so look, to be completely honest with everyone, I've seen two different responses. I've seen the first response, which is disheartening, which is people immediately going, that's too complicated, I don't want to learn this, and then sort of being abrasive about it. But the majority of the people, once you show that you've created the pipeline that can basically limit all failures so that nothing can ever leak out to production, showing them exactly how it works and showing them relatively how simple what we're doing is, the response has been fantastic. And then the next question I always get is, hey, I've been making all these changes and I've been committing all my code in using VS Code and it's all been working really well. I want to know what else I can do. So it really leads you down that garden path of like people that don't have the time or the experience available to really sort of get into DevOps, they're starting to see a little bit of it and wondering what else can be done and what value, what's the value prop of bringing more of this sort of automation into our environment. And it's a lot of like, so this is obviously a very deep, sort of complicated, solution to get over a very specific problem. And when people go, I want to get into functions, you can then turn them around and go, well, okay, if you've never done it before, why don't you look at Power Automate and start creating flows? The benefit of flows is it's the same logic, but you don't need to be able to write the code. You just go in, you drag and drop triggers, you drag and drop tasks, things like that. And it's basically this thing, when people are excited about it, gets them excited about doing more automation, which is really cool.
Nice. So just out of interest, right, if I was wanting to do this in Power Automate, and this is the complete left field that I always do for you, it's unscripted or unplanned, but could I do this conceptually in Power Automate instead of an Azure function?
That's a very good question. So on my lunch break today, I was thinking, okay, so I'm going to show this. I've never shown it, and I was actually I can see Robert has just asked a question. Hi, Rob. I was going to do this presentation at PSConf Europe. At this point in the stage, it doesn't look like I'm going to be able to get there, which is a real shame. And sort of over in Germany, we get real deep dive into this sort of stuff, and it's a lot of fun. But for this session, I wasn't sure how many people were really going to get value from me just like diving into code. So I was thinking, conceptually, how hard would it be to replicate what we've just done in a Power Automate flow? And the answer is not very hard. If you break down exactly what we're doing, all we're doing is we've got an endpoint that's accepting a username and a machine name. It's then getting that username, getting the unique ID of the user object in AAD, and then getting the member of details, and then querying it against a JSON object. You can do all of that, and you could probably build the Power Automate flow in 15 minutes if you knew what you were doing. I think it's a real viable solution if doing what I've just done seems daunting. Is to go into Power Automate and start looking at the built-in tasks and triggers that exist there.
Nice.
Yeah, I got really excited about it, and I almost set it up. I ran out of time. So yeah. Now Rob did have a question. So he was, how long did it take you to make/invent this solution? Also, how did you do it alone, or did you have someone to work on this with you /brainstorm? Now, the long or the short answer is it took me years, but the reason why years is because Steve and I used to work at a different company, and he actually created a fairly complex logon script there that was a VB script that ran on logon based on group policy, but it basically did the same thing where it grabbed a username, it queried AD, and then it did the drive mappings based on that. So years, because Steve obviously spent a bit of time building that out. When he left that company, I tweaked that and made it, more resilient and that sort of stuff. And then when I moved to Vigilant, we got our first Intune job. And when we realized that we needed to create the same-ish solution, we both looked at each other and said, we've done this before. We just need to slightly rethink how we get the data. And that's really the important thing here. It's not what's happening is not complicated. The only complicated part of it was, how do we get the membership details of the user, which is through Graph API? And then how do we query, or how do we create sort of like a table map? So if you're a member of A, you should get this. And it took us probably a month to get a viable solution. Probably not even a month, probably let's say 2 weeks of nonstop work on this to get this working for one client. And then once we had it working, it was, an hour per client to identify, to sort of really.
But let's be honest. It took 3 to 4 days per client to get all the paths and drives that needed to be mapped, because most of them didn't have logon scripts.
Yes. Okay. So client discovery will always take the longest part. That's the important thing to understand. The solution itself that I've written, that I will put up on GitHub, is generic enough that you can use it right now. The trick or the difficult part of this entire process is getting the discovery of how do users currently get drive maps. A lot of places will not have that documented. A lot of places have manual drive mappings that they don't want to tell anyone about. A lot of people, a lot of people have group policy environments that have been set up by someone 20 years ago who no longer works at the company, and they're too scared to touch it, so they're not going to be able to answer. So finding out what the drive mappings are and the memberships and how they get those is the most challenging part of any legacy drive mapping solution. And there's no way that we can automate that, unfortunately.
Yeah, like if you've got existing device management solutions out there, you have the ability of running scripts and putting it into table storage, which we've gone through on the Intune training. Yes, it's not a plug for that, but it is something that we've done.
Yeah.
Where we explain how to go and capture that information into a table store, see the user associated to it, and then going and pulling back what drives are mapped.
That's true. We did do that. I forgot about that. Yeah.
Yep. But otherwise, what you'd be looking at is like you could send out a group policy that does a PowerShell script that scrapes that information and things like that. But unless you've got a way of capturing that information, it's manual. And we had one customer where we literally, when we gave them their new computer, we looked at their old computer and created the drive mappings. And that's the most time-consuming component, right? The putting the information or creating that script. It took Ben a good couple of months of hours at a time getting that up and running. But beyond that, it's all around the data.
Yeah, exactly. This is good, but it's no use if you don't know exactly what the client needs, and nothing can automate that process. You really need a client that's willing and has that data available, or if they don't have it, is willing to go that extra mile to actually start collating the sort of their end users experience and just like what do they currently have right now, and what can we move across, and what do we need to trim. That's really the important thing.
Definitely. So Bruce is asking around customers that well, if your staff are traveling a lot and you need to have a different printer per office and things like that, you'd get away with using something like a gateway IP to map the right printer and things like that. And look, yes, that would work so long as they're restarting their computer or having a trigger on network connection to run a task to run the logon script. Correct me if I'm wrong there, Ben.
No, that's correct. So, all right. At the moment, the way that we generally run our logon scripts is that we're deploying like a bootstrap PowerShell script that generates and creates a scheduled task that is triggered on either one of just one trigger, which is at the logon of every authenticated user, or it's based on the the state or a change state of a machine. So whether they lock the machine or unlock the machine, or whether there's a new connection to a specific VPN connection or whatever. Depending on what the client needs, we can modify that. So the question is, how do we handle people that move around? This solution, as it currently stands, will not dynamically change. But what you could use the same concept to look at, especially if your environment has very well defined subnets. Say I worked at an environment where every single floor of a building had its own unique subnet, and it was very reliable in that if I saw that subnet, I knew that user was on level 4. So in that case, we could dynamically map them to the printer on level 4. So it all just comes down to how reliable the client environment is. If there's no trust there, then you can't start doing that automation stuff. And it goes back to what I was saying initially. You can't automate things until you know exactly how they work, and they need to work reliably. So if you were to want to do something like this in a dynamic way, site-based, IP-based, things like that, you need to make sure that the environment was up to the challenge first.
Definitely. And that comes back to that whole authentication component that we were talking about earlier. You want to make sure that you have the correct authentication, because let's face it, most orgs want to Hello for Business and the shiny facial recognition and the fingerprint auth and things like that. But
Yeah.
they're also typically the same organizations that are sitting there with legacy file service or legacy printers that need to have an additional authentication process put in place. Like Follow Me print solutions, they're fantastic until you need to make sure that they're authenticating correctly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So does that answer your question there, Bruce? I assume it does.
Excellent. Yes, it doesn't. Very good.
Cool. I think that's been a great session there, Ben, talking about how that all works. Is there anything else that people want to go over, or are they comfortable with what we've gone over?
Yeah, thanks, Yap. It's not as good as your shirt. I am everywhere, Rob. Look, I think there's so much that I could go over. If you guys are interested, while we're all in lockdown and I have absolutely nothing else to do with my life, I'm more than happy to sort of join in on these sessions more, and we can go through stuff. It's a real shame that I don't get to travel around and talk about this stuff. So, having people, being in a captive audience is a lot of fun. So as long as I'm not boring people, I'm happy to continue talking about this. And I do have some other stuff that we can talk about at another session.
And that probably leads on to the next question. Obviously, the user group itself runs monthly, but we're more than happy to run additional sessions if people think that there's a need for it. And just feel free to put the feedback on the Meetup page or send us messages. I'm sure Mark, myself, and Ben, and whoever else wants to be involved will help out where possible.
Yeah.
You're going to say something there, Mark?
Oh, no, I was just going to say, tell people not to be shy about posting comments, suggestions, things they'd like covered in the future, because that's one of the things we struggle with, is getting people to tell us what they want to hear about. So it's left up to us to sort of try to figure it out, but more than happy to take direction from anyone.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. And so right now we're currently planned for a session in a month's time, but always we're on the Twitters if you need us and have any questions. So yeah.
And I guess just one other event to plug, an online event coming up over, I'm not sure of the exact details, but I think Rob Crane is on the call. I think he signed up for it already. There's Microsoft 365 May. It was supposed to be a Microsoft 365 Saturday, but for obvious reasons, it's not being held in person. So they've decided to spread it out somewhat. So I think the website for it is still Microsoft 365 Saturday, but on Twitter, I think they've changed it over to Microsoft 365 May.
Nice. And does anybody else have any events that they want to promote or plug or suggest that's worthwhile looking at while we're here?
Nice.
Cool. I think everybody's pretty happy with where that's at. So let's call it.
Yep.
Mark.
Yeah.
Ben.
Okay. Thanks for that, Ben.
Awesome. Anytime.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, Steve. Yeah, Mark.
Bye.
Good job, Dan.
Thank you.
See you, Phil.
Bye.